Welcome. We are reading and understanding the book of Revelation, reading and understanding the message to understand the meaning. What does it say? That must be answered before we ask the question, what does it mean? And confidently asserting that you can read and understand the book. We are studying the third vision of the book. Each of the visions in the book is set aside by the little phrase, in the Spirit. So this is the third vision of the book, God's judgment against the beast, against Rome, Babylon, if you will. Chapter 17, the identity of the opponent was made clear. Chapter 18, we read laments concerning the fall of Rome, climaxed by the parabolic picture of a mighty angel casting a millstone to the sea, declaring that Rome's destruction would be equally great. In chapter 19, the first part of the chapter, we saw the rejoicing in heaven that occurred as a result of Rome's downfall and judgment, the church delivered and ready for the marriage feast of the Lamb. And then in the last portion of chapter 19, approximately the last half of the chapter, we read about the fate of the beast and the false prophet, a symbolic description of the battle between Christ and the beast and the false prophet. Again, the battle of Armageddon that was previously mentioned in chapter 16, the Old Testament account of Gog and Magog from Ezekiel 39 was used to describe the fall of Rome in chapter 16. It's used again here in chapter 19. It will be used again in chapter 20 in describing the ultimate fate of Satan. We must see those Old Testament backgrounds. So much of the book of Revelation depends on understanding Old Testament pictures that are then repeated in the book of Revelation. So we come to chapter 20. A brief overview traces the development of the message, looking ahead to what we will study in this video. In chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, we read about the judgment on Rome, and that is indicated by a description of the triumph of the martyrs' cause. This is a vision of hope. The victory will be won by faithful witness. That faithful witness always lasts longer than the accompanying trials, as we saw already in chapter 6, chapter 11. How long? God is faithful. God's judgment against Satan simply adds to the story that we have already read in chapter 12, the defeat of Satan. Here we have a description of the binding of Satan, the one who has given power to the beasts. And now the abyss is closed up. Satan is enclosed. Satan is bound for an extended symbolic period of time. And that is a reversal of what we read in the fifth trumpet in chapter 9. So then in chapter 20, as we continue, we read about the fate of Satan. When Satan again threatens the city of God, he is overcome by God's surpassing power, and again with a reference to the Ezekiel text of Gog and Magog. And finally, in chapter 20, verses 11 through 15, the judgment on Rome foreshadows judgment on all of God's future enemies. In this judgment, scrolls are opened, and another scroll, the scroll of life. And then in the early part of the 21st chapter, we will see the ultimate victory, God's presence, the presence of the Lamb, the fate of all evil. And we make the distinction, we make the difference in the video studies as we do. We make that determination because of the repetition in chapter 21, verse 9 of our little phrase, in the Spirit. Now, as we come to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 1, we must realize that this is a continuation of the third vision. So much of the story has already been told, and however we understand chapter 20 must be understood in the context of chapters 17 and 18 and 19. But let's talk for a moment about the number 1,000. There is an entire brief video study available in the series about the number 1,000. The Greek word kilia, The Gilead, very common in apocalyptic literature, a symbolic number. We've read about 144,000. We did not expect an exact number from every tribe mentioned. In fact, some of the tribes are not even mentioned, depending on the list that we consult. What is being symbolized? That's the question that we ask. We read about 666. We did not expect to see the number 666 literally stamped on foreheads or hands. The number represented something. We read about 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years, the persecution. Obviously coming out of Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel in the Old Testament. And again, we were not demanding precision concerning the time of the persecution. This is a description from the book of Daniel of the persecution of the Jews during the Maccabean period under Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And the woman in chapter 12 is persecuted for the same 1,260 days. So we try to establish context and understand that the number 1,000 in Scripture is never literal when used with reference to a period of time. So that means we're not to seek a date for the overthrow of Rome or the end of the persecution and then add 1,000 literally to that number. We could easily do that now that 2,000 years of history have passed, and we would arrive at some number between 1,100 and 1,400 that would not have any obvious significance to us. Understanding the text does not require chronological calculations from the past or thinking about some literal time period in the future. John is using apocalyptic symbolism to refer to the Messianic age. We can find many symbolic uses of 1,000 in the Bible. Again, I refer you to the video study focused on that topic, the cattle on 1,000 hills, immensity, quantity, fullness, completion, totality, the multitude, a large number, an extended period of time. And here, John is describing the totality of the victory that is to be won. After the conquest of the beast, after the conquest of the false prophet, then the question remains, well, what about Satan? The question of chapter 6, the witnesses under the altar, how long? Who can escape? These are questions that are now related to the judgment against Rome. Now, I've already noted that we read chapter 20, we try to understand chapter 20, we must establish the larger context. It is perhaps unfortunate that we have a chapter division, since we are clearly continuing the story of the conquest of the rider on the white horse. After the battle, after the conquest of the beast and the false prophet, after the victory over the assembled armies, after the carnage has been swept up by the birds, the story continues. Then I saw an angel coming down out of heaven. This angel will close the abyss, effectively reversing chapter 9, when the abyss was opened. Again, I'm reminded that God is in control of the events in this world, and Satan will be closed up. He will be secure in the abyss, no longer deceiving the nations. This is the binding of Satan, the one who had given power to the beasts. The beasts have been overcome. They've been killed, no longer deceiving the nations. The victory has been won through martyrdom. The victory is complete. It's irreversible. Now that Satan is enclosed, there's no fear that another nation will soon arise to persecute the church. The bottomless pit is closed up. The abyss is closed up. Satan enclosed for an extended, undefined period of time, prohibiting a repeat performance of chapter 11. But the text also notes that Satan will be unloosed in the future after a time of peace and blessing. Note this, chapter 20, verses 1 through 3 is making way for the real storyline of chapter 23 through 6. Those martyred for their faithful testimony are now, after this battle that we read about in chapter 19, are resurrected to reign with Christ, just as the two faithful witnesses were resurrected, perhaps thinking also of the innumerable host in chapter 7 or the 144,000 of chapter 14 who have been redeemed from the earth, those who were first introduced with the 144,000 in chapter 7, the resurrection, please note this, is only for the faithful witnesses, those who had been beheaded for their testimony. The reference to souls reminds us that those mentioned had already died. This is not the general resurrection. The general resurrection is yet future. The resurrection of the faithful witnesses is called the first resurrection, distinguishing it from the general or last resurrection. These verses are giving us the rest of the story that began in chapter 6 with the witnesses under the altar, chapter 11, witnesses resurrected and vindicated. Note that the reign is heavenly, not earthly. Those who reign with Christ are not all the faithful, only those who had been martyred in the context of the book of Revelation for their faithful testimony. We're reading apocalyptic literature. This is not literal. The message is about the implications of Rome's fall, God's judgment, the vindication of faithful Christians who have endured in the face of persecution and suffering great affliction. Which brings us to chapter 20, verses 7 through 10. We've read about the closing of the abyss, the binding of Satan, a time of messianic peace, the vindication of the witnesses who had been beheaded, their resurrection, their faithfulness, faithful testimony. That's not the end of the story. To tell the story of Satan's fate, one must know that Satan is not finished, just as we saw in chapter 12. When Satan was defeated in heaven, he continued the battle on earth. When he was unsuccessful in combating the church, he changed his tactics and began to attack individuals. The same will be true in the future. Satan will try again. He'll look for the opening. He will again seek to deceive nations, assemble opponents. Should the church be fearful? The fate of Satan is described like this. When Satan again threatens the city of God, the people of God, he is overcome by God's overwhelming, surpassing power, again with repeated echoes of the Gog-Magog story of the Old Testament in Ezekiel 39. Remember, that's the same story that was already used to illustrate the defeat of Rome in chapter 16 and also in chapter 19 to describe the victory over Rome. And that brings us to chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. The judgment on Rome foreshadows God's judgment on all future enemies. Notice that the focus is on the unrighteous. In this judgment scene, scrolls are open. The scroll of life is open. The dead are judged according to the things written in the books, each one judged individually. Death and Hades are no more, thrown into the lake of fire. And all whose name is not found in the book of life are thrown into the lake of fire, the second death. But what about the righteous? Those whose names are in the book of life. We've only talked briefly about the martyrs who had been resurrected and vindicated. Well, we'll read about the faithful in chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. The ultimate victory of God's faithful is revealed after the judgment on those who are the opponents of God. The certainty of God's judgment on his opponents includes the certainty of God's promises, his covenant, his protection, blessing, reward on the faithful who endure. The ultimate victory is described God's presence, the presence of the Lamb, new heaven, new earth, new Jerusalem, bride dressed for her husband, reminding us of chapter 19. This is all one story. This is one vision, beginning in chapter 17, verse 1. This section of the text begins and ends then with the same picture, focusing the ultimate message that is to be discerned as we read about God's judgment against Rome and against all enemies. The contrast is drawn one final time in chapter 21 and verse 8, when evil is once again shown to have been conquered. Well, thank you for taking time for a bit more extended study. The next study in this series will unpack the fourth vision of the book, just as the third vision began in chapter 17, giving details of what had been described at the end of chapter 16. Now the fourth vision will begin in chapter 21, verse 9, give details about what has just been described in chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. And that fourth vision will extend almost to the end of the book, as the book concludes with only a short epilogue. Let me take time in a future video talk about some of present day applications. Thank you for spending time that we might read and understand the book of Revelation.